Hello and welcome to week 1 of the Sirdar Blossom and Buds Crochet Along. My name is Lindsey from Lottie and Albert. I am the designer of the blanket and I'm going to be working through the whole thing with you as the weeks go by. But today I wanted to recap a little bit on the inspiration behind the blanket and the design, how we came up with it, and just a little bit more about the construction and what you're going to need to do to join in with us as the weeks go along. So we did talk about this in the introduction video, but if you haven't watched that or this is the first video you're watching, this is our finished blanket as it stands. Today we are starting with week 1, which is the central part in the middle of the panel. Construction-wise, we've gone for a log cabin design. So you may not be familiar with this. If you're a sewer or you've done a little bit of a patchwork blanket before, you might have come across it. Rather than working in rows, we're actually working in panels, joining them all together as the weeks go on. I really like this design for a couple of reasons. One is that at any one time, we're working with quite manageable size panels and putting them together. But the other really nice thing about it is it's not like doing a squares blanket where you have to wait till the end before you join everything together. We are going to build it out week by week as we go. So we get that really satisfying feeling of the blanket growing and the near instant gratification of seeing it build out quite quickly. So if you haven't yet and you want to join in with us, you can head to sirdar.com and sign up there, and that will allow you to get all the updates for the blanket week by week as the videos come out. There'll also be information there on all the yarn that you need. You'll also need a 4mm crochet hook and a few stitch markers to help us when we're joining everything together. The inspiration for the blanket is very much spring and everything floral. So as the weeks go by and we're adding more blossom and buds to our blanket, we'll really nicely tie in with the seasons and the fact that our gardens are growing and emerging from winter into spring. I am a little bit of a wannabe gardener. I love the idea of it and I can handle an established shrub, but I'm working on growing from seed. So whilst my garden frustrations exist, we can express ourselves instead through the medium of crochet. We're going to be using lots of different motifs to create different flowers, different techniques to create different flowers and buds. For week 1, we're working on this central panel here. We don't need to worry too much about our daisy in week 1 because we're actually going to cover that in week 2. But we are going to be creating this central pink panel together. So we're going to start with our oyster pink colour, and then we are also adding this little blue section. So week 1 is very much about creating that central square. We have quite a few different parts for week 1, but they're all on the smaller side. So they're going to build up nice and quickly for us and give us a really pretty foundation for the rest of our blanket to grow from. The main stitches we're going to be learning together in week 1 are half treble crochet, and we're starting out actually really nice and simply with a super easy stitch in that very first panel. We're then going to add in a bobble stitch. So if you've never done that before, please don't worry, we're going to work through it step by step together. And then the final part of week 1, we are going to use exactly the same stitches, but we're going to add in a little bit of a colour change. So again, if that's not something you've covered before, we're going to work through that together in the tutorial video, which is coming up next. So the first thing that we're going to need is our oyster pink yarn and also a 4mm crochet hook. So go ahead and find the tail end of your yarn. And we're starting with panel 1 with a really nice simple stitch. We're going to be using half treble crochets all the way through, and I'm going to work you through it step by step if it's not a stitch you're familiar with. And to begin with, we want to make a slip knot to join the yarn to our hook, and then we're going to make our chain. So there are several different ways of making a slip knot, but I'm going to show you the way that I like to do it, and then feel free if you know another method or there's a way that you prefer to do it that way. So I'm going to hold the tail end just between my thumb and my two fingers. I'm going to wrap it round onto the back of my fingers, round the other side, crossing over, and then just running parallel on the tops of my fingers. I'm then going to insert the hook under the first wrap and grab hold of that second wrap and pull it through. And that's created a sort of little loop for us, which we can just gently pull to tighten to create the slip knot on our hook. And you'll see from your pattern that we want to start with a chain of 24 for panel number 1. And I'll show you just quickly how I like to hold my yarn and my hook. Again, there are so many different ways to do this, and it's really not essential that you do it exactly the same as me. But if you are newer to crochet or you're trying this for the first time, it might be helpful just to see, because when we're making our chain, we want to have a little bit of tension on our yarn just to make sure that our chain ends up nice and even. So I like to wrap the yarn around my non-dominant hand, which for me is my left hand. Just wrap it around my little finger, which creates a little bit of tension, and then hold it between my thumb and my first finger. So I've got sort of 2 points of tension there. One is that little wrap, and then the second is where I'm holding it. So it doesn't need to be super tight, but it just helps give us a little bit of control when we're making our chain or our stitches. I also like to hold this little tail end, so either on this hand or between these two fingers. And again, that just helps steady our stitches as we're making our chain. Otherwise, it does have a tendency to get a little bit loosey-goosey and slide around on the hook. So once you're happy with your slip knot and holding your yarn with a little bit of tension, we're going to go ahead and make our chain. And we're going to wrap the yarn from the back to the front of the hook to create a little loop here. And then to make our first chain, we want to pull this new loop that we've made through our slip knot on our hook. And we're going to let the hook do the work here. So we're going to hold our yarn in place with a bit of tension. And we're going to pull until we reach the throat of the hook, and allow the hook to grab that new loop and then pull through the slip knot to create our first chain. So when we're counting chains, we always count this stitch here, but we won't count the loop on the hook. So essentially what we've made so far is one chain. And we're going to make each one in the same way, wrapping over from back to front, keeping a little bit of tension by holding that tail end there, and then pulling through that wrap through the loop on the hook. So we've now created 2 chains. So when you're feeling comfortable with that technique, go ahead and make 24 chains altogether. And it's just worth noting when we make our chain that we want it to be loose enough that when we come back along to work our first row, we have enough space in each chain to work into our stitches without it being too tight. And one thing that helps with that is when you are chaining, just make sure that you're working along the body of the hook rather than this narrower part here, which is the throat of the hook. So carry on in this way. I'm just going to check how many chains I've got here. So as I said, we're not counting the one on the hook. So far we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And meet me back here when you have your chain of 24 and we will work through row 1 together. So here's how my chain is looking. Now I've chained 24, and this has essentially set us up for the start of our panel. We're going to now work into these chains to create our stitches. And as I said, we are using a really nice simple stitch for our first panel. And it's also just one stitch the whole way through. So it's a great one to get us started with and to get us set up with. So again, I'm just going to make sure that I've got a little bit of tension whilst I'm holding my yarn by wrapping it around my little finger and holding it between these two fingers. And we're going to start by working into the third chain from the hook. So to help us find this, as I said, we're not going to count the one on our hook, but we can see this one here is our first chain, this is our second, and this here is the third chain from the hook. So that's what it means when it says starting in the third chain from the hook. To make our half treble crochet, we want to begin by yarning over. So just like we were doing when we were chaining, we're going to bring it from back to front. And then finding that third chain from the hook, we're going to insert into the chain from front to back. And then the next stage for our half treble crochet is to yarn over. So we're going to yarn over there and then pull up a loop. So when people say pull up a loop, what they mean is we're going to pull this loop that we've just made through this one here on the hook, which should give us 3 loops on our hook. And the final part of a half treble crochet is to yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on the hook at once. So that's created our first stitch. And it's worth noting for this panel that unless we let you know otherwise, our starting chain doesn't count as a stitch. So where we have these 2 unworked chains here, they don't count as a stitch for us. This half treble that we've made here is our first true stitch, if you will. But I'll remind you of that as we get into row 2. So just note that that half treble is our first stitch. We're going to go ahead and make another half treble in the next chain along. So again, just as a reminder, we want to start with a yarn over, insert into the chain, yarn over and pull up a loop so that we have 3 loops on our hook, then yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. And that's created our second half treble. We're going to make one of these into each chain along so that by the end of this row we should have 22 half treble crochet stitches. So carry on in this way and I will meet you at the end of the row to show you how mine is looking and to talk through how we are going to move up to work into row 2. So here's how our first row is looking. We've got 22 half treble crochet stitches and we've worked all the way down to the end of our chain. So we're ready now to move on to row 2. The first thing we're going to want to do is turn our work. So we're always working, if you're right-handed like me, from right to left. So to work back along to make row 2, we want to turn our work around. So we're just going to flip it over in that way and keep your hook in the loop as you do so. So the starting chain 2 does not count as a stitch. So what that means is for row 2, you'll see at the start of the row, we want to chain 2. So just as we were doing with our starting chain, we're going to wrap our yarn over from back to front and chain 1 and then chain 2. And all that's really done is helped get us up to the level we need to now make our half treble crochet stitches all the way along. And in some patterns, the starting chain will count as a stitch. So we'll see here, this is the stitch that's sitting immediately below. Sometimes you'll be expected to then treat that chain 2 as a stitch. We're not doing that in this case. So what it means is that for our first half treble crochet of this row, we're going to ignore that chain 2 and we're going to make it into the top of this very first stitch here. And we're doing exactly what we did on the previous row in that we want to make 22 half treble crochet stitches in total. And we're going to make 1 into each stitch along. So the only main difference here is that now rather than working into a chain, we are working into the tops of stitches. So they do look slightly different. From the top, they look like this little V. And then this small gap here that you'll see is what we want to work into. So yarn over for the start of your first half treble crochet, and we're going to insert into that first stitch. So from the top, it'll look like a little V, and I'll just show you again, that is the top of the stitch there that we're working into. So we've yarned over and inserted our hook. We're then going to yarn over and pull up a loop. And just as we were doing on row 1, we've got 3 loops there. We're going to yarn over and pull through all 3 loops to create our first half treble crochet. So we're yarning over, inserting into the next stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through all 3. So carry on in this way. We're going to work 22 half treble crochets all together, 1 into each stitch. And I'll meet you back at the end of this row just to show you how mine is looking and to talk you through the rest of the panel. So as we reach the end of row 2, I'm going to remind you what we said about the fact that our starting chain didn't count as a stitch, because that's going to help us identify the last place that we need to work into. So obviously we can count and double check that we've got the right amount of stitches. This is the penultimate stitch I'm working into. And then if you take a little look, it can sometimes be slightly hard to identify, but our very last stitch is going to be into this V here, which is into the last half treble crochet of the row before. And we're going to leave that starting chain 2 unworked. So we're not going to work into it. We're only working into the half treble crochet stitches from the row below. So the really nice thing about this stitch and this first panel is that every row from here on in is going to be identical to the one we've just done. It's going to be identical to row 2. So if you take a little look ahead at your pattern, you'll see that it says for rows 3 to 18, we're going to repeat row 2. And the other thing to note about this panel, which is quite nice, is that we don't really have a true wrong or right side. Some of our stitches as we move through the Crochet Along will have a very obvious right and wrong side, because some of our bubbles and our flowers will look really beautiful from the front, from the right side, and from the wrong side, from the back. They'll just be a little bit of a, sort of not a mess, but they'll be the back of the stitches. This panel, however, we don't need to worry too much about that. All we need to do is to repeat row 2 until we have 18 rows. So obviously I'm not at that stage yet. We're going to go ahead and continue working, continue repeating that row 2 until we get there. But I'm just going to show you how we are going to finish off our panel. You'll end up on row 18 pretty much in this position that we are here now. Though obviously we will have a square and not just a short row. And we want to fasten off our panel with a slip stitch. So I'm going to show you that now by fastening off just this short section so that when you reach row 18, you know exactly what to do. So the way that I like to work is to leave myself a long enough tail end to weave in our ends. So if you think about threading this onto a yarn needle at the end, or if you're good and you're weaving in your ends as you go shortly, we want enough length in our yarn so that we can comfortably thread it on needle and then just weave it in for a few stitches. So it doesn't need to be super long, but just bear that in mind. So we're going to cut our yarn, but it's not yet fastened off. It's not yet secure. If we were to just pull on that on the loop, it would start unraveling and undoing our stitches. So the simplest way to fasten off is with a slip stitch. And to create that slip stitch, it's the same process we were using to make our chain. We're going to yarn over from back to front, and then we are going to pull that loop that we've just made through the loop on the hook. But because it's not a chain, we're making, that's a slip stitch, and because we want to secure it, we're actually going to continue pulling. We're going to pull, pull, pull until that yarn end comes all the way through, and then you can just gently pull to secure, and that's created essentially a little knot on the end. We fastened off with our slip stitch. We have a tail end which we can weave in either now or at the end, depending on your preference, and we know that our stitches aren't going to unravel. So as I said, I've only made 2 rows, and in total we want to make 18, but that is the process that we're going to use when we fasten off. Ideally, when you finished your first panel, it should measure approximately 15 centimetres by 15 centimetres. So it'll be a nice square. And when you look at the blanket, the finished blanket, that's the square that appears right in the middle. So it's quite a good measure to see what size yours is coming out. Now, if you find when you finish panel 1 that yours isn't measuring exactly 15 centimetres by 15 centimetres, you don't need to worry or panic. There's a couple of things that we can do. If you're just slightly out, so, maybe by half a centimetre or so, I am more of a, I like to say, more of a fudger than a fixer. I'm more than happy for that to be my size. We're really nearly there, and it's not far out. If you're finding that your square is much larger than 15 centimetres, it just means that you have a slightly looser tension than me. If you're happy and you like the look of it, then you're still getting that sort of square shape, but it's just slightly larger, then you can either leave it as it is, just knowing that your tension is slightly looser than mine, or if it is bothering you and you would like yours to be as close to mine as possible, then you do have the option that you could go down half a hook size or a hook size. Just remake panel 1 and see if that sizing is coming out more similar. If you don't want to remake it and you just want to carry on, just bear in mind that you might end up using slightly more yarn than we have allowed for. But again, everybody's tensions do vary. It's really rare that everybody's square will come out exactly the same size. So it's really just down to whether or not you are happy with it and you want to carry on, or you'd like it to be as exact as possible. Equally, if your square ends up a little bit smaller than 15 centimetres, it just means that your tension is slightly tighter than mine, and you've pretty much got the same options available to you. Your overall blanket may then come out slightly smaller if you decide to carry on with the 4mm hook and you're happy with it in that way, and you might just end up with a slightly denser fabric. So if you're square is coming up much smaller than 15 centimeters, then you want to work in the opposite way. You are going to want to go up half a hook size or a hook size. But as I said, it's really down to you and your preference. It's not an essential thing, but we are basing sort of our measurements on the fact that this is coming out square. So that's really the most important thing. We want to end up with a square. And your sort of tension for this row, although we're using different stitches for some of our other panels, that will sort of be indicative of what size your other panels will also be coming out. So that is pretty much panel 1 to start off with. As I said, take your time. Feel free to come back and watch this part of the video as many times as you need to. And once you have your final square and you are happy with panel 1, we're going to move on to panel 2 and work through that one together. Panel 2 is going to start in a very similar way to panel 1. So you'll notice from your pattern that again we are using half treble crochets and we're still working with our same colour yarn. We're working with our oyster pink. The only thing that we will need to do differently is a very slightly different stitch count. So our setup for panel 2 is going to be a chain of 23. And then in the same way, we're then going to start working in the third chain from the hook, but we're just going to end up with an overall stitch count of 21 stitches, whereas panel 2, we had 22 stitches. And the only real reason for this is, although we want this to turn out the same size as panel 1, we're going to be introducing our bobble stitch for this panel. And so just by nature of the fact that the bobble stitch is a much wider and denser stitch, it's going to push out our overall panel. I mean, there's only one stitch in it, but it's just going to make for a slightly different size to panel 1. So that's the main thing to note. But otherwise, as I said, the way we're working our chain and the stitches that we're using for these first 2 rows are exactly the same. So go ahead and work your chain and then rows 1 and 2 for panel 2. And you will then hopefully have something looking a little bit like this. This is how my panel 2 is looking at the end of row 2. I've just worked 21 half trebles and now I'm ready to turn and start row 3, which is the first row where we're going to bring in our bobble stitches. So I'm going to chain 2. And as before, this doesn't count as a stitch. So it's just bringing our hook up to the right level to work our stitches, but we can ignore it in our stitch count. We're still going to work our first stitch of the row into this stitch here. Now, the other thing to note about this panel, because we are now using a bobble stitch, or we're about to use a bobble stitch, this stitch isn't reversible in the same way that half trebles are. So what we are going to be doing on this row in working our bobbles is we are going to be working a wrong side row. So our view of this row being a wrong side row means basically this is the back of the work. When we come to row 4, our bobbles will be on the front, and so we're calling that a right side row. So that's all that we mean by wrong side and right side. Essentially means sort of front and back, and it's going to help you work out which is the nice side and which is the back of your work. And the other thing to note is that bobble stitch as a term can mean slightly different things depending on your pattern. So I'm going to work through the bobble stitch with you, but if it's something that you're familiar with already, know that this is a 6 treble bobble. So beginning at the start of row 3, we've just chained 2 and we want to work 4 half trebles. So we're going to yarn over and start working in that first stitch. And we're going to work 1 in the first, another one in the second stitch, a third stitch, and then our fourth half treble in the fourth stitch. And you'll then see that our next stitch is going to be our bobble stitch. So this stitch here, we're going to work our bobble. And as I said, our bobble stitch is going to be made up of trebles instead of half trebles. So I'm going to work you through it step by step. We're going to begin with a yarn over, just as we were doing with our half trebles. Insert into the stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. But rather than yarning over and pulling through all 3 stitches, we're just going to yarn over and pull through 2 stitches. Now, if we were completing a traditional treble now, we would yarn over and pull through the remaining 2 stitches, and that would give us a treble stitch. However, in order to create our nice plushy bobble, we essentially want to half make 6 trebles. So we have yarned over and pulled through 2. We're going to leave those 2 stitches on the hook. We're not going to complete this stitch yet. Instead, we're going to go ahead now and work another treble, or half work another treble into that same stitch. So yarn over and insert into the same stitch, then yarn over and pull up a loop, and yarn over and pull through 2 loops only. So we've now essentially half made 2 trebles. We're going to yarn over and insert again, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 loops only. And then we're going to do that 3 more times. So yarn over, inserting again into that same stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 only, yarn over again, insert and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2, and then one final time we're going to yarn over, still inserting into that same stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, and yarn over and pull through 2 only. So we should now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 loops on our hook. And that, as I said, we've essentially half made 6 trebles. So now to complete our bobble stitch, we're going to yarn over and we're going to pull through all of those loops at the same time. So because we have got quite a few loops on our hook and we want to make the motion as fluid as possible, one thing that is going to help us in this is creating a little bit of tension again with our fingers holding our crochet rows down the bottom and just sort of gently pulling our hook so that these stitches are quite taut when we're yarning over and pulling through. It doesn't need to be exaggerated. We don't need to make life harder for ourselves, but just creating that gentle tension so that we can yarn over. And then again, you can do it slowly and you can do it sort of loop by loop if you're worried about dropping any. But we've yarned over and we're just going to pull through all of those loops on the hook. So by keeping that tension on your hook, it just will help you to pull through in one fluid motion. So here's how it is looking from this side, which is our wrong side. And at the moment, it looks pretty similar on the right side of our work too. But what you'll see as we move on to the next stitch is that because this is a group of trebles and it's a taller stitch than our half trebles, when we come to work the rest of our row, it's going to force those trebles to sort of, I don't know what the right term is, is it convex? It's going to make them pop out either way on the back of our work. So at this point here now, we've made 4 half trebles and 1 bobble. We then want to work 1 half treble in the next stitch. So we're going to yarn over, and this is our next unworked stitch here. Insert, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then yarn over and pull through all 3. So I'm just going to pause at this point to show you again how that's looking. Now that we've made the 1 half treble after the bobble, this is how it looks on the wrong side, and then this is how it is looking on the right side of the work. So you can see I haven't sort of pulled it extra tight or anything, but just by nature of the fact that that half treble is a shorter stitch than the trebles that we made here, it's caused them to puff out and create a nice hearty bobble stitch on the right side of our work. So we are now going to make another bobble stitch in the next stitch, and we're going to do it in exactly the same way. It's going to be a 6 treble together bobble. And so I'm going to work you through it again. We're going to yarn over and insert, yarn over and pull up a loop, and yarn over and pull through 2 only. And then we're going to do that 5 more times. So yarning over and inserting, yarning over and pulling up a loop, yarn over and pull through 2 only. So go ahead and work your bobble stitch, and I will meet you back here and just show you again how we're going to finish it off and the next stitches. So once you've made your 6 trebles, or half made your 6 trebles into that same stitch, again you should have 7 loops on your hook. We can then yarn over and pull through all of those loops to complete the bobble stitch. And again you'll see that on this side of the work, before we make the half treble stitch next to it, it's just lying flat, and so it's that next stitch that is going to help cinch it in and create a nice bobble. So after this section, we've done 4 half trebles, 1 bobble, 1 half treble and 1 bobble. We now want to make 7 half trebles. So I've yarned over and insert, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. That's 1 half treble. I'm going to make 6 more, and then we'll be ready to make another bobble stitch. And then I will meet you back here to work you through the bobble stitches and how to finish this row. So you'll see that just making that half treble after the bobble stitch helped cinch it in and give it that really lovely texture. And we are going to pretty much repeat what we just did there across the next couple of stitches. We've made our 7 half trebles, and we are going to work a bobble in the next stitch, then a half treble, and then a bobble in the stitch after that. So that's a bobble in this stitch, yarning over and pulling through all 7 loops, a half treble in the next one, and then a bobble again in the stitch after that. Yarn over and pull through all of those loops. And then you'll see from the pattern that for the rest of row 3, we are just making half trebles. So we want to make 4 half treble and we should have 4 stitches left. So that's 1 half treble in each stitch. And at the end of row 3 of panel 2, this is how it is looking on this side, which, as we said, is our wrong side row. And then this is how it is looking on the other side, which is going to be our right side row. So at the end of row 3, we're going to turn, just as we were doing before. We're going to chain 2, which again doesn't count as a stitch. And for row 4, we want to repeat row 2. So what that essentially means is row 2, if we look back at our pattern, was just 1 half treble in each stitch along. And so in repeating that, we just want to do the same. We want to make 1 half treble in each stitch along for row 4. So when you come to work into the bobble stitches, I'll show you what that looks like. We want to work into the top, and we should just see 1 loop here. So again, it looks just the same as the top of a half treble. It's a little V on the top. We don't need to worry about this part here. We're just working into the top of that 1 yarn over that we did. So go ahead and work 1 half treble in each stitch along. And meet me at the end of row 4. Here's how mine is looking at the end of row 4. We're now ready to move on to row 5. So turn your work and chain 1. And you'll see that with row 5, we've got some bobble stitches. We are going to offset these slightly, so they're not going to be in exactly the same places as we did on row 3. Instead, to create our flower shape, we are going to place 3 bobbles here and then 3 bobbles here, which will give us that lovely flower shape once we've finished. So for row 5, go ahead and follow the pattern. We're going to start with 3 half trebles, and then that will be your first bobble stitch. So as I said, slightly different positioning, but exactly the same stitches as we used for row 3. You're going to be making your bobbles in exactly the same way. So having followed the pattern and the stitch counts given, we should find ourselves by the end of row 8, which is the midpoint, looking a little something like this. You can see how those bobble stitches have formed to give us our really cute little flower shapes. And then in between, we're just working our half treble rows, which are giving us this flat profile in contrast. So after this point in the pattern, we are essentially repeating ourselves. You'll see that it says for rows 11 to 18, we want to repeat rows 3 to 10. So we're going to end up at the end of this panel with 4 flowers in total. And when we do get to the end of panel 2, we're going to be fastening off with a slip stitch in much the same way that we did previously. As a reminder, we're going to want to cut our yarn, leaving a tail end long enough to weave in with a yarn needle. And then to make a slip stitch, we're going to yarn over and pull through the loop on our hook, pulling through all the way so that we can gently pull to fasten off that slip stitch. So carry on working until you get to the end of panel 2, and we will meet back here and have a quick look ahead at what panel 3 is looking like. So here's a little look ahead at panel 3, and you'll note that we are using exactly the same stitches. We're also using exactly the same layout. So the only difference for panel 3 is that we are basically doubling what we've done. So following the stitch count in your pattern, you'll notice that we get to a certain point and you'll see a little star in your pattern. It'll then give you the instructions and say, repeat from star once more. So if you haven't come across that before in a pattern, it's basically a shorthand way of saying, do this part twice. We are working our stitches to here. You'll then see a little repeat from star. So we're kind of going back to the start of the row and repeating it again. And actually a lot of our panels are going to work in this way. I've designed them so once we've done one repeat of our pattern or sort of our stitch pattern, then the rest of the row is a repeat. So because we are still on week 1 and this is one of our shorter panels, we're just doing a repeat once. We're doing one repeat. But as we work through the weeks and we get into more of our different stitches and our different panels, at times we'll be repeating our initial section much more times than that. So it's actually, I think, quite a nice way for us to work, because although sometimes there's a little bit of a learning curve with getting our heads around stitches, there's something quite nice and repetitive about being able to then just repeat that little section again and again. And the way as well in which our blanket is set up and the way in which we're going to join all our panels together lends itself really nicely. We can then work in those long strips and get into a little bit of a nice rhythm and a pattern repeat, and then they'll allow themselves to be joined together to make our whole blanket. So again, what we did for panel 2 is exactly the same for panel 3, but we've just increased our stitch count. So go ahead and work both of those panels. And then I will meet you back here for our next panel, which is going to be exactly the same stitches, but we're going to be introducing some new colours. And so I'm going to talk you through how we are going to work our colour changes and how we're going to manage those yarns. So here you can see we have panel 3, which was our bobble stitch worked just in oyster pink. And that's given us a finished size of approximately 15 centimetres by 30 centimetres. For panel 4, which we're also going to make this week, in theory, they're both ending up the same size too. I feel like my chain was maybe a little bit tight at the start of this panel, and so you can see it's maybe not exactly the same, but that's okay. We're going to work with that. That is enough of a difference that we don't need to worry about it. The main thing I wanted to show you was that, as I said, the stitches for this next panel are going to be exactly the same. The main difference being that we're working with different coloured yarns. So we are working with frost blue, cream and golden for this panel, whereas with the previous panel we did it all in one colour. So for this one, I'm going to show you how we are going to carry our yarn and how we are going to change colour. But just to make life slightly easier on myself, I'm not going to show you the whole panel because, as I mentioned, it's just a repeat of this section. For the purposes of this tutorial and just showing you in the video, I'm going to be working on a smaller size piece. But just remember, you have your pattern to refer back to, which is going to give you exactly the right amount of stitches, and it's going to tell you exactly how many you will need to make these next 2 panels. For panel 4 of our bobble stitch flowers, we're going to be introducing 2 new colours. So I've worked my equivalent of rows 1 and 2 here. Your stitch count will be different, as I mentioned. For panel 4, you'll be starting with a chain of 44 and you're going to be looking for an overall stitch count of 42 stitches. I'm just using this shorter example for the video, but I am going to show you now how to carry your yarn and also how to change colour. So you'll also notice in your pattern that there's a little bit of a change now where we're using a couple of different colours. We have indicated that in the pattern by giving a letter after the stitches. So rather than it just saying, for instance, 4 half trebles, it'll say 4 half trebles with a letter after it. And you'll see from the pattern which letter corresponds to which yarn. So it's just worth noting that if that's not something you've seen before in a pattern, that's just letting you know which colour to use. So once you've reached the end of row 2 in your frost blue, we are going to be ready to start our bobble row. And so for that row, we're also going to need our lovely cream yarn. So go ahead and find the end of your yarn. And to start off with, the first few stitches of this row are going to be in frost blue. So we don't need to work with the cream yarn yet, but we do want to have it ready and available, and we're going to carry it. And what this essentially means is we're going to be holding the yarn and working over the top of it, encasing it in our stitches, which sounds a little bit more complicated than it actually is. So I'm just going to show you, and then we can go through it again just to make sure you understand what we're doing. We're starting the row with 4 half trebles in frost blue. So we're going to yarn over, and at this point I'm just going to lay this cream yarn on the top of my work, kind of around the same level of the tops of the stitches. And what we want to make sure we do when we insert now to start our half treble, we're just going to make sure that we're working over the top of that cream yarn. So now when we yarn over and pull up a loop, and then yarn over and pull through all the loops on our hook, we've essentially caught that yarn in the middle. We're going to leave a little tail end here long enough to weave in with a yarn needle at the end, and it will be a little bit loose to start off with. We don't need to secure it in any way. When we start working our stitches, that is going to help secure it in. So I'm now going to work 3 more half trebles, and again I'm just going to let it sort of sit here on the tops of the rows, and when I yarn over and insert, I'm going to make sure it's on top of the stitch. And I can yarn over at the back, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through all 3 for our half treble as normal. So we're going to work another half treble, and I'm now ready to work the 4th half treble. The main difference here is that we're going to want to change colour. And the easiest way to change colour in crochet is to always do it at the end of the stitch before we need it. So at this point here, where I've got 3 loops on my hook in frost blue, I would normally yarn over and pull through all 3 to complete the stitch. And we are going to do that, but in order to get our correct colour on our hook, we're actually going to just drop frost blue for a moment, and instead we're going to pick up our cream yarn, because if we look ahead in our pattern, we'll see that we want to make our bobble in cream, and so we need it ready on our hook. We want to change colour to it at the end of this stitch. So we're going to yarn over with cream and instead pull through all 3 loops of that half treble in cream. And so what you'll see here is that we've got our 4 half trebles in frost blue, and actually you can't even see the cream on the top of the stitch here, but it is now handy and ready for us, ready to start our bobble stitch. And we're going to be making the bobble stitch in just the same way that you were on the previous panel when we were using the oyster pink. And the only other thing that we need to be aware of is we want to now carry our blue yarn. So just as we were doing with the cream, we now want to carry frost blue. And so I'm holding the active yarn like I was previously. I like to have it wrapped around my finger and just holding onto it here. And the frost blue, the sort of yarn that we're looking to carry, we're just going to leave down here and make sure that we're working over the top of it when we make our stitch. So again, I'll show you what that looks like. Where you are sort of holding your crochet steady at the bottom, just make sure that you see that laying along the tops of the stitches. So we're going to yarn over and insert and make our bobble stitch, and you'll see that each time we do so, we're working over the top of that frost blue because that is now our yarn that is being carried. So go ahead and work your bobble stitch until you have 7 loops on the hook. We now want to complete our bobble stitch, but in just the same way that we changed colour on the half treble, on the final yarn over of the round, we are now going to change colour back to our frost blue on the final yarn over of the round. Because we're working with a bobble stitch, it just so happens that we've got quite a few loops there to yarn over and pull through, but the principle is essentially the same. On the last yarn over of the stitch, we want to change colour. So we're going to yarn over with frost blue and pull through all of those loops. So you can see there we've made our bobble stitch in cream and we switched back to frost blue. We're now going to work 1 half treble in frost blue. So we're going to yarn over, insert, yarn over and pull up a loop. And to make sure that we've got our cream ready for our next stitch, we're going to drop frost blue and we're going to yarn over and complete our half treble with cream. So we've now got our cream yarn on our hook. And we're going to make 1 more bobble in the next stitch, making sure that we're working over the top of our carried yarn. And in the last yarn over, we're going to change back to blue because the next 7 stitches are going to be in blue. So there's quite a few colour changes there. We've done 4 colour changes in quite quick succession. But as I said, the principle for each colour change remains the same. On the last yarn over of the stitch, we want to change colour. So we've there made our 2 bobble stitches in cream. We're now going to make 7 half trebles in frost blue, and that's the same regardless of how many stitches that you're doing. I know my panel's a little bit shorter, but the stitch pattern is the same regardless. So we're going to make 7 half treble now in blue, and each time you do, just remember we want to carry that cream yarn. So we're encasing it as we go. So I've now made 6 half trebles in our frost blue. I'm going to make 1 more. And as we know, because we now want to change back to our cream yarn, our next stitch is in cream. I'm going to drop the frost blue, pick up the cream, and we're going to make that final yarn over in cream. So we've got it ready again to make our bobble stitches, just like we did before. We're going to make a bobble stitch in the next stitch, working over the top of our blue yarn. We're then going to drop our cream and make our final yarn over in frost blue. 1 half treble in blue, making the final yarn over in cream. We've then got one more stitch on this section of our pattern repeat in cream, which is our bobble. So go ahead and make a bobble in the next stitch, all the while working over the top of that blue. And on the final yarn over, I'm going to drop the cream, yarn over in blue, and pull through all of our stitches. We've then got 4 half trebles in frost blue, carrying the cream. And so you'll notice now in your pattern that it'll instruct you to repeat from the start. And the start is essentially visually here at the beginning. So that means that we're going to repeat this little section. I obviously haven't chained enough stitches because I'm just making this smaller swatch, but you will have another section here to repeat, or indeed if you're working the panel after that, there'll be another section again. So you can actually cut your cream yarn. We're not going to need it for the next row. So we don't need to fasten off with a slip stitch or anything because weaving in is what is going to end up securing this yarn. For the end of this row, we can just cut it. We can then turn, and then we are ready to start row 4. We're going to chain 2 at the start of row 4 and then work 1 half treble all in frost blue, nice and easy all the way across. So meet me back here at the end of the row and I will show you the next row. So for the row after this, we're going to be bringing back in our cream yarn, and we're also going to be using golden, which is going to give us those really lovely colour pops at the centre of our flowers. So when you've reached the end of row 4, we're simply going to turn, and again we're going to chain 2, which doesn't count as a stitch. For this row, we're again going to need our cream yarn. So we're going to bring that back in, carrying it just like we did before. We're also going to be using golden in this row. However, we don't need this as frequently. We only need to use it a couple of times. So we're not going to carry this in the same way. It's worth having it out and having it ready. And I'll show you how we're going to use this and when we're going to bring it in. You're going to need your scissors handy for that part. But for now, we are going to start the row just as we did before. We are going to lay our cream yarn on top, ready to carry. So we're going to start this row with 3 half trebles in frost blue. Working over the top of the cream so that we can carry it. And on the last yarn over of that 3rd half treble, we want to change to cream. So we're going to drop our frost blue, yarn over in cream. We're then going to work 1 bobble in cream, making sure we work over the top of that frost blue, catching it inside our stitches. And the stitch after this cream bobble is 1 half treble in frost blue. So again, drop your cream yarn, yarn over in frost blue and pull through all of those stitches. Then going to work 1 half treble in frost blue, At this point where we're ready to yarn over and complete the stitch, we're going to bring in our golden yarn, because the central bobble of each of our flowers is going to be in this lovely colour. So we're going to yarn over instead with golden. And to do this, you'll see I have the 3 loops on my hook from the half treble in frost blue. We can then drop those 2 colours and we're going to yarn over with golden. And we just want to leave ourselves enough of a tail end to weave in our stitches later on. We're going to pull through that half treble with golden. So this is probably at the sort of, not the trickiest bit, but we've got quite a few yarns going on here. So we just want to, essentially, we're making a bobble in golden. And we also are just going to work over all of the other yarns. It's not essential actually to work over this little tail end of golden, but I do find, just as a tip, that it helps to sort of weave in our end for us slightly. So if in doubt, we're just going to work over all of them. We're going to go into that stitch and we're just going to make a bobble just the same way that we have been doing, a 6 treble together bobble. And on the last yarn over of this stitch, we're going to switch back to frost blue. We also don't now need golden until our next central bobble. So I'm just going to cut the yarn, cutting the golden only and leaving enough of a tail end to weave in later on. We're then switching back to frost blue. So we're going to yarn over in frost blue and pull through all those loops. We can now ignore our golden. We don't need it again. Those are just little tail ends that we're going to weave in. And because this is the wrong side of our work here, we are going to leave our tail ends sitting on this side of the work. Because this is our right side, we want to keep this side looking as pretty as possible. We're going to leave those golden tail ends hanging down here. It feels like they're on the front of the work, but we know that because this is a wrong side row, this is going to be the messy part. That's where we're going to leave them for now until we weave those ends in. So we're making 1 half treble with frost blue and we're working into this next stitch. Just make sure you're moving your yarns out of the way so that you don't miss any of your stitches. 1 half treble in frost blue, and then we are yarning over in cream to make that final bobble of our flower in cream. Once you have your 7 loops on your hook, drop your cream, yarn over in frost blue and pull through all of those loops. Once you've pulled through all 7 loops with your frost blue, we're then going to make 5 half trebles in frost blue. So we are going to carry our cream during those stitches. And on the 5th half treble, we're going to want to change back to cream to repeat our little flower section. We then are going to want to make 1 bobble in cream, 1 half treble in frost blue, 1 bobble in golden, 1 half treble in frost blue, and 1 bobble in cream. So just the same as we did here. So finish that final 5th half treble by yarning over in cream. Make 1 bobble in cream, making sure to always carry the yarn that we're not working with. Once you've got your 7 loops, yarn over in frost blue, pull through all of those loops to colour change. We then want to make 1 half treble in frost blue, so yarning over. But before we do our final yarn over, we're going to bring back in our golden colour, just as we did before, and make 1 bobble in golden. Leaving that nice long tail end so that we can weave in later. Complete the half treble in golden. And if you feel like your half treble there where we've dropped our yarn has gotten a little bit tall or a little bit loose, we can just gently pull on the tail end of the frost blue. We're then going to make that bobble stitch in golden. So remember here, we definitely want to carry our blue and our cream, and it doesn't hurt to work over the top of the tail end of the golden either. So carry on in this way, following the pattern, remembering to colour change and always carrying the yarn that you're not using. I'll meet you back here at the end of the row and show you from the right side how this is looking. So once you've reached the end of the row, we can again cut our cream yarn. We want to keep our frost blue yarn on our hook, because our next row is going to be a row of half trebles only in frost blue. So here's what it's looking like from the wrong side. And then here we can see it's starting to take shape on the right side. If you feel like your bubbles are a little bit flat, you can just give them a little bit of a push to help pop them out. It's probably just where we've changed colour. They haven't quite popped out yet. So our next row is a simple row of half trebles all the way along. And then for the row after that, which will be, let's double check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for row 7, that is going to essentially be a repeat of row 3. So we again will want to be carrying our cream yarn, but we don't need to use golden in this repeat row. So at the end of panel 4, we should hopefully have ended up with something a little like this. It should be measuring approximately 15 centimetres by 30 centimetres, and we've used all those 3 lovely colours. Panel 5 is very similar. We are just working with a slightly different stitch count. So by the end of panel 4 and panel 5, you should end up with 2 looking something like this. So again, you can see quite clearly now where we have our pattern stitch repeat. For panel 4, we just repeated it once, and for panel 5, we're going to repeat it twice. When it comes to joining the panels for your blanket, we are going to be using a double crochet join. I have already joined here panels 1, 2, 3 and 4, and then I'm going to talk you through how to join panel 5. But in doing so, it's actually going to give you a really good indication of how you're then going to go on and join all the other panels as our blanket grows and we move on to subsequent weeks. So I'll just give you a little bit of a view of what the join looks like. We always form the join on the back of our work, and we're using a double crochet join. So we're not sewing them together, we're crocheting them together, and it's a nice, simple way, a method of doing it. Now, one thing that you'll note, and especially as our blanket grows, is that when we come to joining our panels, we won't always be joining into the tops of seams. So as we join panel 5 here along the top, we're going to be joining into the tops of stitches here, but then we're always going to have a section where we are working into the side of a panel as well. So the way that we have indicated all of our joins is that each time you're joining a panel, and so in this instance it's panel 5, we're going to use the stitch count of the panel that we've just made as a guide. So it keeps things a little bit more simple for us. We don't have to worry too much about counting and working out approximately how many stitches to make per row. We're just going to use the stitch count of the panel that we've most recently made to join. Now all these stitch counts are also given in your pattern, but I just wanted to point that out, that that's the approach we've taken to keep things a little bit simpler. One thing that I like to do when I'm joining these panels, and I think this makes things a little bit easier, is to use a couple of stitch markers. And so the simplest way to do this is to find the sort of midpoint of your panel. And depending on how sort of precise you like to be, you can of course count your stitches, but I quite like to do a nice fold. And because a lot of our patterns are repeats of blocks of stitches, this should make things a little bit easier for us. So we know that the halfway point is going to be sort of dead in the middle of these. And we also can see here that this middle of this panel is going to be our midpoint to join in the middle. So I always like to start with that. You can also, count or fold here. As I said, depending on how precise you like to be. And this it doesn't matter if it's a bit loose, we don't need it to be sort of cinched together or really tight. It's just to sort of help us manage our panels as we're joining, and particularly as we move through the weeks and the panels get longer, this is quite a helpful thing to do. So I'm going to also put one at the end, so that's nice and easy for us. We can sort of see where those two panels want to match up. And I'm going to put one at the start, maybe just in the second stitch so that we can join easily. And as you progress through the weeks and you're working with larger panels, you may also want to sort of find the quarter points and mark those with stitch markers too. So the important things to note, you always want to place the long panel that you're joining on the top, and we are joining them right sides together. So the pretty bits on the inside, the right sides are together, and we're making the join on the outside. At the end of each week in your pattern, there is a little diagram and also a written description of which panel needs to sit where. The other thing I'd recommend, because obviously we are working here with two different colours, is to always use the yarn of your top panel to join. So again, I'll just flip you over quickly. As I was joining these two panels, I've used Oyster Pink. But here where I joined panel 4, I have used the Frost Blue. And for this section that I'm going to show you now, where I am joining a Frost Blue, I'm going to be using that as our joining yarn. So it's not essential, but that's the approach I've taken with the blanket if you want to copy exactly what I've done, and that's what we've detailed in the pattern as well. So I'm going to find the first stitch on panel 5, and I'm going to insert my hook. And at the same time, I'm going to insert my hook into the top of our oyster panel behind. And then going to yarn over with Frost Blue, leaving a long enough tail end for us to weave in later. Pull that all the way through, and then we're just going to chain 1 to secure. You can probably take out our first stitch marker now. Now we're secured through both layers. And as I said, we're going to be using a double crochet join. And we're going to be using our frost blue stitches to indicate where we need to put our stitches. So insert through both layers, through the top of the stitches, yarn over and pull up a loop, then yarn over and pull through 2. I'm going to move across now to the next stitch in frost blue. And the reason we're suggesting this is because your stitch count isn't always going to match up. The stitch count of the panels we're joining to won't always be exactly the same as the stitch count as the top panel. And as we said, particularly as we're joining into the sides of rows here. So follow the stitch count of the top panel that you're joining. And just allow your hook to find and pick up both panels so that we're always joining through both layers. As you're progressing through the join, just double check that your stitch marker sections are still matching up nicely. So here's a little look at what it looks like on the back. And then from the front, you will obviously see a little bit of stitching, but we haven't got the ridged join like we do on the back, on the wrong side of our work. So carry on joining with your double crochets in this way. And I'll meet you at the end of this section just to show you how the join is looking from the back and from the front. When you reach a join or a section like this where our panel on the top is continuous, but we're working over a join below, again, we're going to be led by the stitch count of our top panel. So don't worry too much about where the placement is. We just want it to be nice and even all the way across. So you can see here, my stitch on my front panel is matching up nicely with this last stitch on the panel behind. But the next stitch on our front panel is actually sitting pretty much on top of our join. So it's just a case really of making sure that as you're working into the second panel, you have enough on your hook and you're working into, you can either work into the front of the join or the side of the stitch, just whatever feels natural and is closest. The only thing we want to avoid really is working too deeply into the panel underneath, because that will just mean that our stitches are a little bit more visible on the join on the front. So just where you can find a natural place and enough of a stitch to sort of pick up behind, all the while using your top panel as a guide. So here's how that is looking on the front. And every time you hit a stitch marker, depending on how many you've chosen to put in or how wide the panel is you're joining, you just can take those out and pop them to the side. So at the point I've reached now in my join, I've worked all along into the top of the oyster pink panels, and I've now hit the section where I'm actually going to be working into the sides of stitches of this frost blue panel. So I'll talk you through how to manage that. We obviously are being guided still by the stitch count on our topmost panel. So we want to work 1 double crochet into each of those. And then hopefully we should have our fabric, particularly at this point that I'm at with this join, because we've sort of worked evenly here. They're matching up size-wise nicely. It's just that we don't have a direct stitch on the second panel to match up with our stitches on the front. And the way that we're going to manage this is simply by working into the side of the row and picking up the stitches there. So if this isn't something that you've done before, don't worry too much. We just want to make sure that we have enough yarn there on the reverse of our panel to comfortably insert our hook into and create a join. Again, you don't need to work too deeply, so we don't want our hook, for instance, to be inserting down here where there are true stitches. We're fine and we're very happy working into the side of a panel. You may just find that your hook meets slightly more resistance, but it's just a case of sort of pushing it through the sides of those stitches and making sure that we have enough yarn to join to. And we're working 1 double crochet into each of the stitches on our top panel and just allowing our hook to pick up the side of the row that sits directly behind it. Every now and again you might get in a tangle like I did there, but that's okay. Just insert again. Find the easiest route. So as you reach the end, as I said, I'm just going to take that little stitch marker out and I'm going to make 1 final double crochet. I'm going into the top of that last stitch there and just make sure that you are going into, it doesn't need to be the corner, but just the top of that panel. We can then fasten off with a slip stitch. So cutting our yarn, leaving a long enough tail end to weave in, yarning over and slip stitching and then pulling our tail end all the way through. So here's how the join is looking on the reverse. It's sort of this raised double crochet row. And then here is how it is looking on the front of the panel. So we have got our 2 little ends to weave in, but otherwise, if you're at the same stage as me and you've just joined panel 5-2, then we've also completed the beginning of week 1. And another thing to note about the pattern, again, this is all detailed with the little diagrams that show you where to join, but we're essentially always building in a clockwise direction. So we've gone 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And then next week, we'll also add panel 6 and then panel 7 along the bottom. So we're always joining in a clockwise direction. So now that we've worked through all the techniques and stitches for week 1, you have everything you need to work through the different panels and to start bringing together and forming the base of our Crochet Along. As a recap, we covered how to make a half treble, how to use a bobble stitch to create our fun little flowers, then how finally to carry the yarn and also change colour to create our bobbles in a contrast colour. Please feel free, as I said, to work through at your own pace. You haven't missed anything by not working the central daisy. Here's just a little teaser as to what's to come next week. So that will be week 2. Week 1 will see us bringing together all of these panels and joining them. If you are making along and you want to share any photos with me, I'd really love to see them. I'm going to be popping into the Facebook group, which is the Sirdar Make Along group on Facebook. and hopefully seeing what you're up to, chatting to a few of you and saying hi. It's also a really lovely place to share tips and to chat with other makers as we are working through. I hope to see you in the Facebook group, and if not, I'll see you next week for week 2.